It's my pleasure and Kaylen's pleasure to be here as well. There's our contact information for the two of us, my moderator Kaylen and myself, and that will be coming up at the end of the slideshow as well. So please don't feel rushed to take it down, but do take it down. We have resources that we can send out at the end if you request them for us, or we also provide counseling and support to grieving and bereaved people, whether your loss was years ago or whether it was just yesterday. So I just wanted to show a picture of where we work. This is a 10-bed residential hospice. We have our offices there, but right now we're working remotely, and we have 24-hour, 7 days a week nursing care there. But we work mainly in the community. What our objectives today is to distinguish between bereavement, grief, and mourning. Discover what the signs of grief might be. And there are many different types of grief. We'll be talking about a few of them, but not all of them, and how COVID has impacted grief, and how COVID has even extended our grief, and what to do if you identify that you are grieving. So what's the difference? A lot of people say we're bereaved, and bereaved is a state of being when somebody has died. But mourning is the outward expression of the grief. And so it's an actual turning towards the grief, and it's an active choice to choose to mourn. And it's through mourning that we actually process our grief and heal. Grief is our response to the loss that has happened to us, and it shows up in our behaviors, our emotions, our psychological state as well. And it's sometimes you can see our grief because we're crying, or sometimes you can't see it because we're just ruminating about it. We're sleepless, and so it's sometimes it's easy to see grief and sometimes it's not. And I want to make sure that people understood that grief is not pathological. It is normal, and it's a normal response, and it's like a reflex. We can't help it a lot of the time. It's like a reflex. And loss, well, we've all suffered loss, especially in the last few months. We've had a loss of connection, a loss of work, a loss of purpose sometimes, even if there hasn't been a death in the family. And so anything that destroys some aspect of our life or self is considered a loss. And loss usually involves change. And certainly we've experienced a lot of change lately. We've had a change in our safety, macroscopically. And we've microscopically, may have experienced a loss of a dog, a loss of our future, loss of a dream. Loss is, as we can see it all around us. And if you're particularly interested in the idea of loss, but not necessarily associated with death, this is a lovely book that you can order online by Darcy L. Harris. So loss involves uncertainty, and with COVID, there has been a lot of uncertainty about what will happen next and when it will happen. We've definitely had a disconnection from our normal human experience. And some of us, some of our losses recognized. Some of the people in our household are enjoying this time of isolation. And they're just saying, well, we just want it to continue for a long time. And other people are going squirrely. So everybody experiences loss differently, and no way is wrong or right, and it's just your unique way. But there's often an association of helplessness and powerlessness with the sense of loss. Often we see grief show up in our bodies, like physically. But we are more than just our bodies, more than just our physical self, and we're combined of body, mind, and our emotions, and that makes us a total human being. And when all these three aspects of ourself come together, that central area here, that where we make meaning of what's happening to us physically, what's going on in our minds and what's going on in our hearts here, where we make meaning in the spirituality of it, is sometimes where we're most affected by grief and loss. Some people call that the soul. So there are physical signs of grief, like crying, fatigue, weak immune system, definitely appetite changes. And maybe you've felt some of these changes yourself as we've gone through COVID, whether you've had a death in your family or not. You know, a lot of us are eating more, some of us are eating less. We have extra body aches that we've never had before. And we've had emotional signs of grief. You know, we're spending a lot of time with family. We might, you know, feel misunderstood at times because we're all coping differently. We can be irritable and maybe fall into a bit of depression. So there's lots of ways we feel grief and loss emotionally. And that we can have signs of emotional suffering. And so we can be uncharacteristically angry. We can, we just throw in the towel and have a disregard for ourselves. And could be a sense of hopelessness, but those are all signs that we're suffering emotionally. And then there's cognitive or mental effects of grief and loss, forgetfulness, worries, racing thoughts. I remember when I was in my state of grief, I lost my bank card like 3 or 4 times in 3 or 4 months. I just left it places, and my mind was just like gone. It couldn't concentrate. And so if these things are happening to you, then perhaps you are overwhelmed with all these things that are happening, body, mind, spirit. And socially, with COVID, we've been forced into the effects of grief and loss. We've been forced into our relationship changes, into our cocooning. We've been forced to give up some of our pleasurable activities. We haven't been able to celebrate holidays and anniversaries in the same way, and there's definitely a disconnection from our community. And then there's spiritual aspects of grief, where we've been having, some of us may have spiritual questions, and you don't necessarily have to be religious to have spiritual questions. Spirituality is that central part of us where we make meaning and purpose, and we find purpose, and we contemplate pain and suffering and life and death and reasons and abandonment and things like that. And so the COVID, and if you've experienced a death during COVID, it all, you know, can center in this place as well. So there's many different kinds of grief, but I feel like these 5 ways are the ways that we've experienced grief during COVID, that we see the future a little bit, like perhaps with elderly parents, that they're trapped, and we maybe anticipate that we will have to say goodbye to them. And so we're anticipating, we are grieving before the actual event. And that's a way of preparing ourselves for what's to come. And we can have complicated grief, and that's often grief that because of unresolved traumas in our past, like abuse or racism or poverty or struggling trauma, it complicates our grief, because we're not just dealing with one thing, we're dealing with many things. And if you've had a loss after a loss after a loss within a short period of time, that can be cumulative grief. And then there's traumatic grief. If somebody in our life has died traumatically or violently or suddenly, we weren't expecting it, that can all impact the different ways we experience grief. And of course, in our culture and all over the world, we're experiencing a collective grief. You know, we're collectively grieving racism and the death of George, I missed his name, George Floyd, I believe, yes. So it's these are a couple kinds of grief, but the whole goal of working with grief grief work is integrating the grief. Grief is long lasting, and we don't just get over grief, we walk through it, and grief becomes a part of us, entwined into our lives. And we learn how to adapt to the loss, accepting the reality and the consequences and the changes in the relationship and the possibilities of a future with purpose and meaning, joy and satisfaction that is in the future. On top of grief, we're all experiencing vicarious trauma, which is experiencing trauma, but you're not actually going through the trauma yourself. You're just seeing and hearing it. So it's in our back pockets, in our iPhones and in our iPads all the time. We can just Google, COVID, and you get to see what the whole world is suffering with. And, when we hear about the protests and the racism, so these are not firsthand traumas, but it's vicarious trauma that affects our sense of grief, because we are grieving for the whole world. And so Elizabeth Kubler-Ross initially did research on the stages of death and dying, but her ideas have been adapted, and they've been adapted to saying that we have these stages of grief. And so yes, I believe that we do often experience some or all of these, and some say we just go down here and up like this when we're trying to move through grief, but a lot of people find that it's pretty much a messy thing, and that there's no clean way of going through grief. There's a way of thinking of grief as going from grief work to attending to life and changes, and then you go back to a grief experience, and then you have a denial experience, and then so it's a back and forth, and in the middle here, that's where we experience our everyday life and getting up, but we go back and forth as we experience, and that's how we move through grief. We've also seen grief as a grief in the box, and you can picture this red buzzer here as pain. And so when we're initially going through grief, everywhere we turn, we bump into the walls. That buzzer, that pain buzzer, is on. But as over time, our grief shrinks a little bit, and so that pain buzzer is not hit so many times. And so you can, be free to say, oh, my grief ball is really big today, and that's what it feels like today. But some days it will get less and less, and so that your pain buzzer won't be triggered as often. Often we find that grief is just tangled emotions that don't make any sense, and you're feeling them all at the same time: rage and fear and depression and confusion and panic and apathy, and they're all feeling all at once, and sometimes they show up in our body. But when we speak to somebody and talk to somebody about it, retelling your story can actually help to make sense of what has gone on. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross says, you will never get over the loss of a loved one. You will learn to live with it. You will heal, and you will rebuild yourself around the loss you have suffered. You will be whole again, but you will never be the same. And this is what integrating grief is. COVID and grief, mostly COVID, it impacts all of our needs. Physiologically, it's impacted our way we get groceries, and our masks impact our body because it's hard to breathe. Our sense of security is impacted because we fear infection. Our love and belonging is changed because we're not with the same people that we'd like to be, perhaps. And our jobs have changed, and we may not be finding the same kind of purpose and meaning in our job situation. And then we have questions of meaning and purpose. So COVID has complicated our grief. We've not been able to participate in our regular rituals and funerals. We've been isolated. There's a lack of social connection. We're working from home. We've got that extra stress. And we're witnessing personal suffering of our loved ones, perhaps from a distance, and it leads us to a sense of helplessness and sometimes hopelessness. And we've paused many things, but we cannot pause grief. And that's what makes it hard. Before COVID, we were all living in this green area here. You know, there was ups and downs of life, but we could handle them. This is called the window of tolerance here. But then COVID has come along and caused a stress in our life. And so all of a sudden we're bouncing around, and we can actually stay up here, which is stuck on sort of an on position. And so it's sort of an on, like everything is hyperactive. There's anxiety and panic and sleeplessness, and we can't concentrate because different parts of our brain are activated. And then sometimes what COVID has done is it has sent us down here, and it has created sort of a stuck on an off position. So that leads to depression and lethargy and disorientation, poor digestion. And so the point of talking about grief and trauma and how COVID has affected us is trying to figure out how to get back here in the window of tolerance. Some of us have had a life such that our area of resilience is very small. And so something small can knock us out of this place of resilience. While others, we have had the benefit of developing our resilience over time. We've got this wide range here, and we can cope with more. But COVID has moved a lot of us out here or down here. And, you know, don't beat yourself up about that. That's part of being human, and it's part of learning self-awareness and learning how to take care of yourself. And so how do we take care of ourselves in the midst of all this? And so, you know, I have learned that self-care is not an emergency response plan. And just to, you know, when I'm feeling bad, I can't just put my self-care in place. It has to be an ongoing daily activity. And it should be intentional and integrated into our daily lives. Because COVID and our life, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, and we've got to make it through to the end. And so we need to take care of ourselves, and having a good cry is sometimes one way to even take care of ourselves. Just let it out, ride the wave of grief, and find somebody to talk to about it. So just like when we have a wound, a physical wound, we clean it out and we pull the edges together and we give it proper nutrients. So also having a psychological hurt or grief or trauma can also cause difficulty, and we need to clean it out. So by talking, we can clean out some of the guilt, the resentment, the shame, the negative thoughts we have about ourselves or others. And we can bring the edges together by connecting to our strengths and our resilience, to connect to the people who you can trust. And those people, and learning about what your resilience is and your strengths are, those are the nutrients that will help to grow through this difficult time. So self-care is about ABCs, so awareness, balance, and connection. So self-care is about self-awareness, and I just love this tree here. And it's ways, so often we think about self-care as awareness of what's happening with our body. I've got, you know, tension in my shoulders, or I'm crying often, or I'm feeling lethargic. Those are all bodily things that we often do. We'll go to the hairdresser, we'll go for a walk. But there are so many things that we can do for our mind and our emotions and our spirits. And this tree is a lovely depiction of so many great contemplative practices that we can engage in with movement, ritual, stillness, activism, creativity that can really spur us on. Also journaling. I have a great journal. If you've been through a grief experience with a loved one, I have a great journal, a digital journal that I would be happy to send to people that will ask you questions, and you can journal in that. So if you'd like that, just let me know at the end. So awareness is one thing, balance is another thing. Just make sure that you attend to all 4 parts of yourself: the physical, the emotional, the spiritual, and the mental. And also self-care through connection. And I know COVID has really impacted us in our ability to connect, but we're already, you know, trying hard to learn new things like webinars and Zoom conferences, and we got to give us a pat on the back for learning and growing through this and learning how to connect in different ways. And so our grief is part of our vulnerability, but our vulnerability helps to build connection. And if anyone wants to hear or read more about vulnerability, Brené Brown does amazing things. If you'd like to know how to spell her name, email me and I'll recommend some things. But she does great work on vulnerability. And vulnerability through connection makes us stronger. And knowing about grief and trauma and COVID and the impact gives us power, which breaks down our fear. And I love this quote from Mr. Fred Rogers: anything that's human is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable can be more manageable. When we talk about our feelings, they become less overwhelming, less upsetting, and less scary. The people we trust with that important talk can help us know that we are not alone. And so that brings me to the end of the talk, and I just want to recommend some resources about loss, about grieving and complicated grief. And if you know of someone who's grieving, this one is about helping companioning somebody through grief. So thank you for your attention and for this, and I'll just leave this information up on the screen.